Thank you, and thank you all so much for wanting to listen to me for the next around 45 minutes. I think I will be talking. What I will be presenting today will also be a little part of my thesis, and I will do it quite generally and broadly, and I will cover a lot of ground. So, yeah. So I have some preliminary remarks. First of all, my focus is on the classical Arabic concept of nature. So it's in the period from 800 to 1300. This is also called the Islamic Golden Age. So in this period, a lot of Greek scientific literature is translated into Arabic, and this kind of makes the Islamic context and all this flourish. So we have a lot of new scientific thought, we have a new philosophy developing, and so on. And also it's in the period where Islam is like just started, so to say. I do not presuppose in this presentation that there is a single concept of nature, either in Arabic or Greek thought. I think there are tendencies we could look at, and I think the tendencies are quite distinctly Aristotelian, but also Neoplatonic, and I will show this to you. So Arabic philosophy, you can also more narrowly understand it as Islamic philosophy. So this basically means that it's philosophy practiced by Muslims. This is what I look into. So all the thinkers I also will be presenting to you today are all Muslims. What this means is that the Quran, but also other prophetic literature, such as Hadith, this is like stories about what the Prophet Muhammad did, they take a very authoritative role in the thinking. So it's not that much different from like Christian philosophy, where the Bible has a very authoritative role. So what I will do is I will tell the story from phusis, which is the Greek concept of nature, also where you have physics from, to ṭabīʿa, it's right here, we see nature in Arabic, and it's the translation of phusis, and I will do a conceptual history, basically. So I will do it in the following way, and I also have a central claim that I will defend and expound for you. So my central claim in this lecture, and also in the first part of my thesis, is that ṭabīʿa is nature in Arabic philosophy, nature as such, nature as a formative principle, was not an indigenous idea or thought of early Arabic thought, rather it emerged as a product of the Graeco Arabic, the Greek Arabic translation movement, mid-9th century. Also, the very choice of the translation, of using this word, my argument, introduced internal tensions within the Islamic intellectual framework. Yes. So my structure is this. I will talk a little bit about phusis in Greek philosophy, so phusis over here. Then I will talk about pre-Islamic Arabic and Qur'ānic sources, this context. And then I will tell you how they met in the translation movement. So I have one thing over here, one thing over here, and then they meet. And then new things happen when the Islamic philosophers adopt this idea of phusis as ṭabīʿa. Yes? So one thing over here, one thing here, and something new. Okay, so we start with phusis. And again, it's very broad. So at least to my knowledge, one of the earliest places where we find the first use of phusis is in Homer. It's from the Odyssey. So here, so saying, Francis gave me the earth, pulling it out of the ground, and showed me its nature, phusis 2. And the root was black, but its flowers was like milk, moly the gods called it. So what we see here is that nature of this flower is described as some outer characteristics. It's a very particular instance of this plant. It's not abstract in any sense. And this is, at least if any of you know an early instance of the word, please confirm. Moving on to a more philosophical context, in the first place we see it in a more abstract way is with Heraclitus. So Heraclitus tells us in this very obscure remark that nature loves to hide. I think what we get out of this, of course you can interpret it in quite a lot of different ways because it's Heraclitus, but what we see here is at least that nature is quite a hidden principle, it's an eternal principle, it's something within things itself, and what we already see here just a little bit is that phusis is a fundamental but multivalent term. It can mean the structure and order of the cosmos, of the whole thing, totality, or the particular constitution and inner principle of each thing. This thing we also get more expounded in Aristotle. But here we have a more general, abstract sense of phusis. And Heraclitus, some of his fragments were also translated into Arabic. But he didn't have a huge influence or anything. So definitely the most influential philosopher from Greek into Arabic philosophy is Aristotle. So we also need to look into his concept of nature to understand this Arabic concept. So what does Aristotle tell us about phusis? So Aristotle seems to carve like everything into two categories. He states in the beginning of the physics that some things exist or come into existence by nature, and some through other causes. So by nature, phusi, and some through other causes, other ideas. So we have two categories here. The first category, by nature, this would be the elementary substances, and also those substances compounded, which would be something like plants and animals. And we also have the second category, things that are not by nature, that would be craft work, artifacts, so to say, cultural products, also called technique. So the most interesting part here is, of course, what he means by nature. Yes? So when he defines nature, he states that things of nature have within themselves a principle of movement, or change, you can also translate it as, and rest. So to some extent, nature is is that which moves itself, is an eternal principle, but we also have other definitions of nature in the physics where it's defined as medium-passive, infinitive, so to be moved. But what is quite clear is that nature is something that moves by itself, something that is internal, something hidden. This is in contrast to cultural or crafted products. They always have an external cause, for example, a craftsman, something other like forming it, so to say. What is also important, and comes right after in this definition, is that nature is something that belongs to a thing essentially, not extensively. So nature is the defining thing. It's also sometimes understood as the form of the thing. You cannot take it apart from something. So, for example, that all humans are animal. This would mean this is an essential thing. But, for example, the location of an object, or for example, being bald or something like this, is an accidental quality. So, even if you're bald, you're still a human being, which is good, of course. So, what is important here is also to understand what this movement or change mean. And to understand this aspect, we need to look into Aristotle's four causes. Yes? So for Aristotle, when we need to describe the movement or motion of a thing, we need to describe a thing in general, we need to have four causes. When we want to understand the why of an object, we need these four causes to give a necessary and sufficient description of an object. So Aristotle has four causes. We have the material cause, the causa materiis. This is the thing, or the matter composing a thing. So for example, with a statue, it would be the marble. If we have an acorn, or something like a tree, it would be the matter the tree is made of. Then we also have the formal cause. This is the form or the essential feature of a thing. It takes precedence over matter. So it's the form that makes a thing the kind of thing it is. So for example, the human form, or the form of an oak or something like this. Then you also have the efficient cause. And the efficient cause is that which initiates the change or the motion of a thing. So the efficient cause, the causa efficiens, is what moves the thing from being merely potential to actual. And then you also have the final cause. So for example, this would be the sculptor, like the person crafting the sculpture. Or it could be the oak tree that the acorn is fallen from, together with other causes, for example, heat. And then you have the final cause, the purpose for which something happened or was made. So for example, with the statue, it's probably to be some type of ornament in a temple, but for the tree or for the acorn, it is to become a mature oak. So you can use these four causes both to describe technique, like artifacts, but you can also use it to describe natural objects. Motion is always moving from potentiality. So for example, a block of marble has the potential to become a statue. When it does this, it's actuality. It is the efficient cause that makes something from potential to actual. What we see here is that form and purpose coincide, and try to come to completion or perfection. It is also a very teleological and functionalistic definition of nature. Nature is necessary, it's not free to create, so to say. Nature is quite determined or necessary by causal laws, in Aristotle's opinion. Hope this makes sense. Yes? So, one more thing that is also very important to understand the concept of nature in Arabic philosophy, is Aristotle's view of God and nature. If you can say there is a God in Aristotle's philosophy. I think there is, but yeah. What is important to understand with Aristotle is, for him, the universe is not created. The universe is eternal, it is merely set in motion by a God or by the unmoved mover. God is the causa finalis, like the thing that is strived towards the end. It is the object of love and striving of everything. It is pure actuality, form or thought. So God has quite a limited role in Aristotle's philosophy, if you can say so. God is not meddling in anything, it's not forming anything, or something like this. And nature, phusis, is quite substantial on its own. It is self-creating, it has its own efficient causes within it, it has the forms immanent in matter, and it is quite substantial on its own. It is necessitated, so to say. Of course, this becomes a very hard thing for the Islamic philosophers to deal with. So this is basically some of the most important points of Aristotle's natural philosophy that gets transmitted into Arabic philosophy and also get treated, and I will look at this also earlier. The other very important philosopher for the Arabic tradition is Plato, or the Platonic heritage more broadly, especially Neoplatonic philosophy. So a lot of Plato's dialogues are, as far as we know, were not translated into Arabic directly. Most of them comes through paraphrases. So for example, we have this transmitted to us, Plato's Timaeus, but in a paraphrase from Galen. We don't have the Greek original, but we do have the Arabic text. It's around 35 pages, and it's a very difficult read. But this text became very influential also in Arabic philosophy. What we see here, and what they probably imported a lot of, is that nature, or the cosmos in the Timaeus, is fashioned with mathematical forms out of a pre-existing chaos by a good craftsman. Of course, a lot of the thinkers within the monotheistic traditions often thought this good craftsman to be God. Also, what we see here is that nature or cosmos becomes created more from outside, and we also see that God, in this instance, the demiurge, the good craftsman, the artisan, is also an efficient cause through operating through mediators. So it's not merely the final cause as in Aristotle's philosophy, but we see a more hands-on God, so to say. Also, the universe, in some ways, is living, endowed with soul and intelligence. We have the idea here of the world soul, and we get a more, at least a bigger and its physical definition than we have in Aristotle, where it's merely or more a functionalistic understanding of nature. This is also carried into Neoplatonic philosophy, and especially within the Arabic context, there is quite a lot of Neoplatonic philosophy. So two of the main sources of Neoplatonic philosophy in Arabic philosophy are the Plotinus Arabus and also the Proclus Arabus. So there's a lot of compendia translated into Arabic, and for example, Aristotle's theology is one of them called. This was part of Plotinus' Iliad, which were translated into Arabic and had the title of Aristotle's theology instead. And we also get Proclus' Elements of Theology. This book was also translated, part of it, into Arabic. This is some of the ways that this philosophy is interpreted or got into the Arabic English. What we also see with the Neoplatonic heritage is that nature is something through which even those things that are most devoid of soul participate in a kind of soul. So this idea of an soul cosmos is carried further, and also is a very big part of Neoplatonic philosophy. We also see this is Jonathan Leibniz, who was a Christian Neoplatonist, And he wrote an extensive amount of commentaries on Aristotle's philosophy. And most of these were also translated into Arabic. Some of them were translated into Arabic with Aristotle's physics. So you had the Aristotle's physics into Arabic, and then you also had the commentaries alongside it. One of the things that Philosophers criticizes Aristotle for is that he has only shown the activity of nature, so this very functionalistic understanding of nature, but not what nature is, but is theistin, so to say. He has not shown what its substance is, its phusis. So for John Philosophers, this is resolved through ensoulment. So he states that nature is a life or a power that is descended into bodies and that forms and governs them. So here we also see a more ensouled and heavier definition of what nature is. Yes. So this was a very quick run-through of some of the Greek sources. But what I want you to take from this is that in the Greek legacy, I think mainly here phusis or nature is primarily understood as an inherent or internal principle. It is something hidden in things. It is something that is defining for them. It is formative, it is self-contained, and it is at times ensouled. You only have limited tendencies to understanding nature as something being externally influenced or something affected. Nature is quite substantial on its own. And especially the philosophy I presented to you now, the Aristotelian but also Neoplatonic philosophy, is translated into Arabic in the mid-9th century. Okay. So this was some parts of the Greek philosophy. Now we move into the early Islamic parts, or Arabic parts, before the translation movement, so before the mid-19th century. So we have the phusis here, and now we have the context for ṭabīʿa, as it becomes nature. So I don't want to force you to learn Arabic grammar, but I will anyway force you to learn a little bit. Because it's a very different language from Greek, from Latin, also from Danish, English, Swedish, or whatever. Yeah, no. So an important thing is that Arabic language, most words are composed of roots. So a root is usually 3 to 4 consonants, and these roots, for example, kaf, kaba, or ṭabīʿa, they are like the smallest semantic unit. So they have a field of meaning attached to it, but they are not a word in themselves. But for example, if you look into a dictionary, you don't look up words, you look up roots. So if I want to know what the word is for book, for example, kitab, I will look this root up, these 3 consonants. So what is important to note here is that these roots, they become a word by putting vocals into them, for example like here. He wrote, Yakubu, he writes, but you can also, for example, add a prefix, Bakr, then you have a participle, this would be a written document, you have kutub, kitab, book. What I want you to notice is the important part here is that all of the consonants, they of course keep their order, so it's not like they change order or anything, and you can see how the semantic field is associated with it. So it's not that different, writing something and then book. Does it make sense? Yeah. So this is also why it makes sense to explore a semantic field. Looking at a root, for example, ṭabīʿa, which is the root for nature. ṭabīʿa. This little one here is a full consonant in Arabic. But when you do the transliteration, it looks not so much, but this full letter here. Okay, so what does this root mean, or what is the semantic field of this root before the translation movement, before the Greek philosophy is imported into Arabic? This is what we will look into now. So a way to look at this is to look at pre-Islamic and early Arabic Islamic poetry. So it is important to know that the Quran, the Holy Scripture of the Muslims, it stabilizes the language of Arabic. So a lot of grammars afterwards are made from the Quran. So the Quran does a lot for the Arabic language. But before you have the Quran, you, for example, have poetry. So the revelations to Muhammad is said to be around 610 to 632. So in this period. But you still have literature from before this. So this root, what does it mean in this pre-Islamic early context? So I have here 3 poems, or 3 like snippets from poems. For example, in Labid ibn Rabia, here it states, talking about his weaponry and armor, they do not rust, la yaqba'una. Maybe you can see here that the root of that ein goes again in the concept of nature. Nor are the deeds ineffectual, since the mind do not incline or cabbage. So here, this root for nature, that becomes nature, is associated with rust or corrosion. And you also have like a more metaphorical reading where it like refers to also the deeds afterwards. In Aus ibn Hajar, it's even earlier, 600, here it states that brave and lavishly, be generous, he never succumbed to weakness, and he did not die blemished. ṭabīʿa. Again here, it's something about being corroded, being dirty, blemished, or being rusty, or something like this. Even later on, quite also a long period after, the Quran has been like connected. We see here that Ibn Sharik, talking about his sword, states that it is of color as steel, neither newly polished, nor dull, nor mangy, nor rusty, nor mangy. So you have it here also. So it is important to note here that this semantic field of the root in the early period means something like rust, something corroded, or something like this. And this root is generally very, very rare. Like I found, I think, around 15 poems, which is very little, where this root is used. We have other like roots that are used like more than 1,000 times, something like this. This is very like a rare root. And also, every time they use this root, it never refers to the domain of nature in any sense. It does not denote something natural or something like this. It's rusty or it's like a defect in moral character. Okay, so this is the pre-Islamic period. When we move on to the Quran, and here the dates are 610 to 632, but we think that the text, as we see it now, the Quran, probably looked like it does now around the year 700, but this is very contested. Here the root for ma'ayn, again, this root that becomes nature, ṭabīʿa, occurs at 11 times. This is not a lot. 11 times is like it's extremely little. You have other roots that occur again here like more than 1,000 times in the text. And it always occurs as a verb, meaning to seal. For example, thus does Allah seal the hearts of the unbelievers. You can see here, Ba'u, Allah is the subject, we have the verb here, and then we have the hearts of the unbelievers. Seal here is always a moral consequence, it's a punishment for moral deficiency directly from God, and it always used as something sealing from without, something externally that is impresses in and like seals the hearts. So with the root for nature, that becomes nature, is used in this way in the Quran. A question you might ask then is, are there any other roots or any other semantic fields that could be associated with nature instead? So other roots that could be used for something like nature, but I don't think they mean nature in any sense, would be something like khalaqa, he created, the created order, qadara, to determine, decree, measure, or fitra, which means the inner constitution by God. But we don't see this root, ṭabīʿa, meaning anything pertaining to the natural domain in any way in the Quran. And other roots always talks about what is created by God. Of course, it is in an abstract sense, but it's not something like nature as a domain or anything like this. When we look to the immediate context of the Quran, for example in grammar or lexicography, we see like the same story. So for example in Khalil ibn Ahmad, he has a book called Kitab al-Ayn. So this is a dictionary. But this, what I think is quite fun with this book is that it's not alphabetically ordered. It's ordered how the noises occur from the letters in the throat. So if you say "I'm," this is very deep down, so this is the first one, and then the other one comes up. So it's not like alphabetically ordered. And you also have Sibabe. But in these earlier grammars, the root is omitted entirely. So it's not an important root in this period of time. The first instance I found, an earlier one, and you can see it's quite late also, this is around the period where the translation movement occurs. Here's defined ṭabīʿa, so the same thing, as stain or flaw, and it's again this pre-Islamic poetic thing about being solid or blemished, something that's not pure in some sense, either concretely or metaphorically. Also, when you look at early papyri, here it is the verbal use of the Quran that's used. It means to seal or to stamp a receipt, ṭabīʿa. When we look at that, this just means literature, hadith, stories about the prophet, or law text, fiqh. We have very few occurrences of this root. So from 700 till 820 in the database I've looked into that has like a lot of these documents, we only have 16 occurrences. And also later on, for example, here with the translation movement occurring, we have 86, so here it explodes a bit more. And after 920, it's insane, it's like almost uncountable. So this root becomes a very big thing after the translation movement period. So, to summarize. So before the translation movement, this root, ṭabīʿa, that becomes to mean nature, belongs to a semantic field of corrosion, moral defect, so rust, being blemished, someone that has an impure heart or does not follow God. It is not linked to the domain of nature in any sense, and it's always something, at least in the Qur'ānic sense, that is affected from outside. It is the hearts that are sealed from outside, so to say. It is not something internal. It's said in general a rare root before the translation movement. And I think what we also see here is you have quite a close connection in pre-Islamic and Islamic usage. Like it makes sense that something is rusty or corroded and doesn't work. And also it's the same with the hearts. Like it's a moral defect. It is something that is not functioning properly, so to say. But we get a quite new semantic range at the translation movement. So this is like mainly the first part of my argument. So what happens with the translation movement? What is going on here? So the translation movement occurred in Baghdad, Iraq, during the Abbasid dynasty. It starts quite early, so some of the earliest translations, we don't have those, but around the year 800. And then some of the most authoritative translations are made in the circle of Hunayn and Ishaq. Quite confusingly, his son is called Ishaq ibn Hunayn, so it's sometimes a little bit difficult to tell them apart. And also al-Kindī, who is commonly known as the first Arabic philosopher. So these two and the circle around them in Baghdad kind of establishes the new philosophical vocabulary. And though the translation of those two becomes the most important ones. During this translation movement, which started from around 800 to 1000, you had a lot of Greek that were translated into Syriac and into Arabic. So a lot of Greek literature, medicine, scientific works, philosophical works, especially Aristotle's works and so on, were translated into usually Greek, Syriac and Arabic, but sometimes also from Greek directly into Arabic. So what happens here is you have a whole new technical vocabulary, but also new ways of thinking. For example, this concept of nature, as I tried to show, I don't think this was indigenous or was like a part of Arabic thought earlier. So this is a new kind of concept, a new way of thinking about the natural world that is important into Arabic philosophy and into the Islamic world, where you have a whole different worldview and another religion and so on. So it's like quite an astounding thing. Of course, this translation movement also had both a practical and intellectual aim. For example, to support medicine, practice astronomy, administration, as well to provide rational tools for theology and law. And it was funded by these rich people in the Abbasid dynasty. So like we know, research is usually funded. So I just want to show you here quick that, for example, from this manuscript, it's called Marsh 539. You have a lot of different Greek material that is translated into Arabic, and phusis is standardized across disciplines as a new concept, and it's always translated as ṭabīʿa. So I'm not going to dive into all the definitions here, but you can see, for example, Aristotle's definition, nature, ṭabīʿa, is the principle of motion and rest, in that to which it belongs primarily and essentially, not accidentally. Phusis is across the board every time, at least from these translations from al-Kindī and also Hunayn always translated as ṭabīʿa. There isn't any other word used here. This is like the standard phrase. And even if we talk about both natural philosophy, but also medicine and so on, of course, the distinctions of field were not that sharp as they are now. But still, medicine, philosophy, and so on, it's ṭabīʿa is the standard rendition of phusis all the way across the board. What is even more important here is Aristotle's physics, which was also, of course, translated into Arabic. in several versions, but the one we have and the only one that survives is the one by Ishaq ibn Hunayn. So the son of Hunayn ibn Ishaq, around 910. And one of the most important things here, besides the concept of nature being translated, is also the efficient cause. You can also call this the agent cause. So this was the one that initiates the movement or change of an object. And what we see here in the translation is that it states here, this is from physics, it's from the Arabic version, and cause is also said to be that which is the source of the beginning of change in stillness. We have the definition of nature, and cause here is said is the efficient cause, the one that causes the change or stillness. For example, the mover is the cause, and so is the father of the son. In general, the agent, fa'il, is the cause of what is acted upon, maf'ul, and the changer of the change. What is important here to notice is the translation of the agent. So fa'il comes from the word fa'ala, and it literally means the one who acts or the agent, the doer. I think what we see here is that we have like some connotations, especially in the use of this word to render an idea. You have some connotations that are like maybe more of intentional willed action and also a tone of personal agency that are not that clear maybe in the Greek, but here it becomes very, very clear. So why is this very important? It is because it is one of the most discussed topics in Arabic philosophy concerning nature. So we see phusis, like the Greek concept of nature. This becomes ṭabīʿa, but how equivalent are the concepts really, and can they coexist? Where phusis, I think, when we see generally, primarily concerns an internal principle, a self-sustaining principle. ṭabīʿa also appears to contain strong connotations. We see this from the pre-translation movement sources of external principles, like efficient and formal causes. This idea of sealing or something impressed from an outside, whereas phusis maybe is more something internally. The efficient cause also here becomes extremely discussed because, as we saw before here with fa'il, it is concerned with agency. And why is this important? It's important because where does this agency lies? Is this agency with nature itself, as we see more in Greek philosophy? Or is it, for example, with God? And you need this in Islamic philosophy. You want God to be more an efficient cause. If nature becomes too substantial on its own, as it is, for example, in Greek philosophy, then this would take away from God's omnipotence. So a lot of the discussion that goes on within Islamic philosophy is both how to understand nature, but also how to delimit nature in some sense, because the Greek concept may be too strong for some of these philosophers. Does this make sense? So if we have a movement, does movement start within things themselves, or are they like just derivative of God's will, so to say? So this is one of the like most discussed thing in Islamic philosophy. And now we'll present to you some Islamic philosophers who wrestled with this idea, who wrestled with the phusis as translated into ṭabīʿa, and how they talk about it, how they discuss it, and so on. So the first one to look into is al-Kindī. So al-Kindī is also described as the first philosopher. It's a transliteration of the Greek word for philosopher, or philosophia also. And what this means is that he was the first Arabic philosopher, or the first philosopher to engage with Greek philosophy, but in Arabic. So he's like the first one that starts with this. And it's important to say also that these philosophers, for example, al-Kindī, but also the others I will present to you, they did not know Greek in any sense. They only had the Arabic text, and they only had these translations to work with. He worked at the heart of the Magnus relation movement, you know this. Also, what I think is quite funny is that he was described by the famous polymath al-Jahis in the book of Mises as an infamous miser and swindler, especially in his role as his landlord. So there were a lot of discussions and also maybe a little bit of strife between these early philosophers. Al-Kindī, he upheld a mathematical, epistemological ideal, like he drew inspiration from Euclid. Yeah, I think that's how you say it in English. And used this ideal of mathematical truths like sentences that you derive things from. You also see it, for example, in Proclus's elements of theology. And he wrote in a wide range of fields, both astrology, astronomy, and so on, physics. He also wrote about ophthalmology, that's how you say it, like vision and so on. So what does al-Kindī tell us about nature, and what does he talk about? So he gives two very strict definitions of nature, and he does this in his books. On the definitions and description of things. So this work here, this treatise, is an Arabic lexicon. It's an two Arabic lexicon. So it's basically a lexicon that will help the Arabic reader to understand these new Greek concepts. So it's a long list of different definitions, for example, also of reason, logos, which is aql in Arabic, and so on. So what does he say? He says that nature, ṭabīʿa, the principle of motion and of rest from motion, so basically Aristotle's definition here is reused, it is the first of the faculties of the soul. And you also see here how it is like read in conjunction with the idea of soul. So he kind of like seems to reuse and buy this Aristotelian idea of nature as a principle of motion and rest from motion. And what we also see in this treatise is that we have like quite a Neoplatonic order of the entries. So in this treatise we have the first cause, we have intellect, aql, then we have ṭabīʿa, then we have soul, and then we have body. So you see both the Aristotelian influences, but also a lot of the Neoplatonic. Of course, in a Neoplatonic hierarchy, these would be changed. In the second definition, he does more or less the same thing. He states the definition of nature for the sake of instruction. It is the principle of motion and rest. In its true reality, it is the organizing power for bodies. So I think what we see here, like at least at first glance, is that we have quite a departure from this Qur'ānic and also Islamic heritage. It seems to buy the Aristotelian idea of nature as something that is self-contained, internal, something that is the principle of motion, and he does not seem to reinterpret or re-romanticize this earlier meaning of something sealed from without. He seems to follow Aristotle quite stringently. However, al-Kindī also talks about causation. As you see, I have like a birth theme with these al-Kindī. But yeah, on causality, on the true first and complete agent, he states that here limiting ṭabīʿa, limiting nature. As for whatever is below him, here he means God, of course. I mean everything that he creates, they are called agents, metaphorically, not in the true sense. So all of them are in fact acted upon. So I think what he states here is that he limits the Aristotelian definition of nature in some sense. Instead, he argues that all real causality and all real influence and so on belongs to God through hierarchy. It's not, nature does not act on itself, not on its own. It is not something self-contained or anything like that, but it's totally controlled from outside to some extent. However, things can act, though only metaphorically. So here we see, I think, a synthesis between two semantic fields and also philosophical fields. We see that ṭabīʿa occupies an intermediate position. Nature is the organizing principle within bodies. It is something internally a little bit, in some sense. We have the Aristotelian definition. But at the same time, this movement or organizing principle, internally things, is always derived from God's will and externally beyond. So here you see like a synthesis of the Qur'ānic view and also the Islamic view, and of course nature itself. So nature in the Greek sense. How long have I talked, Rasmus?
A couple of minutes.
Oh, okay. So, okay, I will tell you about one more philosopher. This is the early Islamic philosopher Abū Bakr al-Rāzī. He was quite an interesting thinker. There are a lot of great pictures of this guy, which is quite nice. Cool ones. He was called Rāzī in Latin, which I also think is a nice name. He was a physician and also a philosopher. He's very influential. I think he's probably the most influential, maybe the most influential physician also in the Middle Age, besides Avicenna or even Sina. But his philosophy was very critically receptive. So al-Rāzī, he posited that there are 5 eternal principles. You have God, or the creator, al-Bārī. So this word for creator is more like the word demiurgus or artisan that we see from the Tzmaz. It's not like Allah or something like this. You have soul, nafs, you have matter, you have time, you have place. So you have 5 eternal principles. And if you know something about Islam, this is not it's generally frowned upon. So he was regarded as a heterodox thinker, and he was also accused of shirk, which is the idea of placing something alongside God. So in the Muslim thought, they have something called ṭabīʿa, which means the true oneness of God, or like really the oneness of God. But al-Rāzī, he posits 5 eternal principles that are alongside God. So this is not really so great for him. Generally, the source material is very poor regarding al-Rāzī, because all the source material we have are from people who were very critical of him. So we don't know how accurate they are in presenting it. But we have something about nature. In the treatise on metaphysics, which is a very fragmentary work, but a quite nice and succinct work in some ways. And you have 3 things that he does in this text. He talks about the concept of nature. This is what I will be presenting to. He talks about embryology, so like how embryos are evolved, and also the eternity of the universe. So what does al-Rāzī think about nature? So first of all, he starts with a critique. al-Rāzī states that the Aristotelians, and he does not buy this at all, claim that nature has no need of proof, for it is manifest and people acknowledge and affirm its existence. This is probably from the beginning of book 2 in the physics. So Aristotle, for example, argued that nature does not need proof, so to say, it is manifest, and al-Rāzī thinks this is not true at all. So he states that in response, a thing does not become true merely because people acknowledge it, just as it does not become false because they differ concerning it. If it were true by virtue of their acknowledgement, it would also have to be false by virtue of their denial. And thus a thing would be both false and true, which is impossible. Yes, so agreement does not constitute demonstration. Right? Just because we agree on something does not mean it's true, and this is basically what he states. And generally, the text is very dialectical. So he's stating like, they say this, I say this. They say this, we say this. So what he says is that only things that are directly perceived and the first principle of rational demonstration require no proof. So there are some things that you can actually say are true without no proof, and these are things that are perceived, and also principles of rational demonstration. However, nature cannot be sensed, and knowledge of it does not belong to the mind's first self-evident truth. It's a statement. So al-Rāzī kind of flips the script here and says that the burden of proof lies solely on with those who claim that nature exists as an explanatory principle. So who are these people? Here al-Rāzī particularly critiques John Philoponus. In Arabic philosophy, he is known as Yahya, which just means the grammarian. And he also tells us about his definition of nature, which is nature is a force that penetrates bodies and governs them. But al-Rāzī do not think this is a very good definition. He thinks there is like an internal contradiction in the Aristotelian view of nature. So he states that you say that nature acts only with wisdom and correctness, has like a necessary and teleological mode, that aims at a purpose, that it does one thing for the sake of another, as when it forms for the embryo the eye for seeing, the hand for grasping, and the molars for grinding. And yet, despite all this, you claim that nature is lifeless, neither living, nor sentient, nor capable, nor choosing, nor knowing. This is a clear contradiction and manifest absurdity, for the qualities you describe to it belong only to a living and voluntary being. So the problem is that the Aristotelians describe nature according to al-Rāzī as lifeless, but at the same time they attribute to it all these things of being alive, so to say, what he associates with being alive. So al-Rāzī's conclusion comes to be that nothing can act, aim, will, or affect anything unless it is living and choosing. For al-Rāzī, this would be God, or soul. But what is imprinted, madfa'u, maybe here you can see that the root goes again for ṭabīʿa, is dead and cannot be described this way. So I think what al-Rāzī does here, maybe in contrary to al-Kindī, is that he kind of reactivates or recalls this core root meaning, this core meaning of the root, this Qur'ānic sense, this maybe also almost pre-poetic sense, but I think mostly Qur'ānic sense, where there is something sealed from without, and that which is sealed from without will always be passive or not active or willed or something like this. So for al-Rāzī, nature is dead, it is impressed or shaped by an external agent, and causality and motion come from living and will-governed principles like God or soul. So al-Rāzī does not deny causality and anything like this, but he does deny that nature is an explanatory principle in itself. So for him, the concept is almost like empty, or at least a problematic concept. Okay, I think I will round off now. So some concluding remarks. The Islamic worldview, I think, shapes the translation of phusis as ṭabīʿa. These, I think, additional connotation of external causes that are in ṭabīʿa, sealing, imprinting from without, which this word mostly means, are welcome and are also often like expounded upon or used or like really emphasized, particularly by al-Rāzī, but also by some of the early theologians. What we see in Arabic philosophy is that nature becomes less of an eternal principle, it becomes less necessary, it is not governed by necessity in nature, by forms, for example, that determine how things act. Rather, it is governed externally by God or by God's will. ṭabīʿa also here is like kind of a meeting of worlds, so to say. In pre-Islamic and Qur'ānic Arabic, the root here belongs to a moral and theological field. However, what we see means to seal and press. However, with this Graeco Arabic translation movement, we see that ṭabīʿa acquires quite a new life, also as this inner source of motion, this Greek, so to say, this Greek semantic field. And of course, this concept of ṭabīʿa raises a lasting question, namely, does motion begin within things or from an external agent? So ṭabīʿa becomes the site of negotiation both between language, philosophy, and also revelation, where this will's motion both became a question about God. And we see this discussed like through the whole period, 500 years, where there are a lot of texts just discussing all this stuff.